welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on our briefing session on modern slavery and infrastructure. It's fabulous to have you with us. There might be a couple of others as we drift through, but we might kick off the session so that we can run to time. My name's Laura Harkin-Small. I'm joining you today from Gubbi Gubbi country up in Queensland, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and certainly extend that respect to any traditional custodians of First Nations people who might be joining us on the call today. We have a jam-packed agenda prepared for you today. We're really conscious that there's a good chance we have varying levels of awareness and progress around the modern slavery journey on the call today, and we've tried to assemble an agenda that will cover off on this content no matter where you are on that journey. We're going to spend the first part of the session just having a broad look at what is modern slavery and how is it of interest to infrastructure and what does that mean. We will then have a run through of modern slavery, reporting against the Modern Slavery Act, particularly key trends and opportunities since it was introduced a couple of years ago, and then spend some time sharing a little bit about our Modern Slavery Coalition and some of the enthusiastic and passionate members that have been working to progress our knowledge and our community's knowledge around modern slavery. And then we're going to have 15 minutes at the end to talk through any questions from the audience today before we close and hopefully get you off back into your days on time. Just a couple of administrative notes that chat will be closed, but certainly for this, if you've got any questions along the way, feel free to put them into the Q&A buttons, the Q&A button down the bottom, and we'll look to weave those through. We'll also have the opportunity to follow any of those questions up online or offline after the session's finished. So please feel free to put your name and organisation in if you feel comfortable doing so. I might introduce a little bit around the people that you'll be hearing from today. So I might go to the next slide. Thanks, Lauren. So firstly, today is I'm welcoming you today on behalf of our Modern Slavery Coalition, who assembled in 2019 in response to the Modern Slavery Act. I'll go into a bit more detail later on in the session around exactly what the coalition is and what they're doing and future work and how to get involved. But certainly want to acknowledge the key members and partners that have come on as part of that work over the last couple of years. I thought it would also be timely to introduce myself. Some of you may not have come across me yet. I'm Laura Harkin-Small, obviously the Head of Advocacy at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, and been with the team for about 6 months. So as I find my feet and certainly get a lot more involved, looking forward to meeting more of you out and about across our different programs and focus areas throughout the organisation. You'll also be hearing from two amazing subject matter area experts in Vanessa Zimmerman and Alex Coward from Pillar 2. Pillar 2 are our partner in delivering the Modern Slavery Coalition program, and I'm really excited to be able to share some of their expertise and knowledge throughout this session today. Vanessa is CEO and founder of Pillar 2 with deep business and human rights expertise, and Alex is modern slavery specialist and had a hand and was involved in the drafting of the Modern Slavery Act a couple of years ago at the federal government level. So without much further ado, I might hand across to Vanessa to kick us off with our first topic area.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody. Thank you for making the time today. It's really great to be joining the IS Council in providing this webinar today. So just before we get started, we do have a short poll just to see what types of functions you're from and also to get a sense of your current knowledge around modern slavery. So if we could just start the poll, please, that would be great. That should be popping up for everybody. So it's just what business function do you work in? And then how would you rate your level of understanding of modern slavery? So we're starting to get a sense. So it looks like we do have quite a few sustainability folks on the call. then other, and then procurement and legal, which is interesting. And then most of you seem to have the highest percentage is a moderate level of understanding, and then a lower level, and then last a higher level of modern slavery. So that's good for us to know today in terms of where we're heading with our discussion. Thank you. Thanks, Ali. We can stop that now. All right, so I'm just going to start with, what do we even mean when we're talking about modern slavery? It is quite a significant phrase, and what it really means is any form of really taking away somebody's freedom for the purposes of exploitation. And it is quite a big umbrella term. It includes types of abuse such as forced labour, debt bondage, human trafficking, the worst forms of child labour, forced marriage as well. And shortly I'll take you through a couple of examples of what these types of situations might mean in practice, and the red flags that you might need to look out for. Freedom from modern slavery is an internationally recognised human right. So when we think of the giant bucket of human rights that we all have as human beings, within that are labour rights, which relate to a lot of different forms of rights that we seek to have in the workplace. And that includes freedom from slavery. And then modern slavery is kind of, as I said, part of that labour rights bucket, although sometimes other forms of modern slavery might not be related to labour, such as forced marriage. But this is a good way to look at it, particularly if your organisations have human rights policies or approaches to human rights and you want to see where modern slavery fits in. Modern slavery is really just one of the internationally recognised, or freedom from modern slavery is one of the internationally recognised human rights that we are all entitled to enjoy as human beings. Just on to the next slide, thanks. So why and where does modern slavery happen? So the answer, modern slavery happens everywhere. It happens in every part of the world. The graph, or the map on the slide, is from the Global Slavery Index. This map is now a couple of years old and we're waiting for the update to come out. But what it shows is that every country around the world can have some prevalence of modern slavery. What you're seeing in deep red are some of the countries that this index is assessed to be higher risk for modern slavery. And as I said, this was a couple of years ago now, but we know that modern slavery can occur here in Australia and other developed countries as well. It is not just a problem for emerging economies, though, as you can see, some of the instances of modern slavery in countries around the world that are weaker governance or from emerging from conflict can sometimes be a bit worse. Some of the factors that tend to lead to higher instances of modern slavery can be, as I said, places that are emerging from conflict or have weaker governance and weaker systems and mechanisms to check up on labour conditions and address vulnerabilities. In situations as well where we have certain populations in certain countries that are more vulnerable, perhaps they're marginalised, might be populations that have been discriminated against, those types of populations sometimes can be very vulnerable to modern slavery because they sometimes have no other choice but to take work that may put them in those positions. And they include migrant workers in some places, as well as women, children, and some other groups in certain situations. Just on to the next slide. Thanks, Alex. So we wanted to give you a bit of a sense as well around the risks relating to infrastructure, and I'll have more information in a moment on some of the particular categories of risk. But this is a map from the Responsible Sourcing tool, which is a really helpful tool that has some support from the US government. And this basically looks at different industries around the world and shows where there might be higher modern slavery risks relating to that industry. So this is for construction and this is for bricks. And this is showing that there are particular countries around the world that they have assessed to be higher risk when it comes to the kind of provision of bricks to the industry. And as I said, they have this for some other categories as well. And on the right-hand side is just a case study from the US Trafficking in Persons report, which comes from the US government, just to show one of the more common types of situations that we can see sometimes relating to the construction sector, which is situations really of debt bondage, where there might be workers that have been enticed to come and work at a particular construction site with the promise of a job and very good working and living conditions, might be asked to pay a recruitment fee. When they get to their place of work, they might be told that it's going to take several years for them to pay off the recruitment fee they've had to pay. And in the meantime, their passport or other identity document might be handed over. And in that situation, those people might be considered in a situation of debt bondage because they really have no choice but to stay in their current role. And this is unfortunately something that we have seen in the construction industry, more overseas than here in Australia, but we have also seen some instances of these types of situations in Australia as well. Just on to the next slide, please. So these are just to give you a couple of real life examples. Unfortunately, these examples are drawn from real situations, just to unpack some of those different types of modern slavery. So forced labour are basically situations where people are forced to work under the threat of a penalty. And so an example here might be that a migrant worker, let's say a woman in this case, accepts a job to be a subcontracted cleaner on a site. She's given a contract in English, which she really doesn't understand. She's asked to stay in accommodation provided by the employer, and once she's there, it's very difficult to leave. People might be watching her. She isn't paid, and she's told that if she complains or tries to escape, her family will be harmed if she tries to leave. That is a type of situation where someone is working basically under the threat of a penalty and would come under the forced labour example. Debt bondage is really the example that I gave before, so I won't dwell on it too much, but situations where people basically are having to pay off a debt and have no real ability to leave that situation. And as I said, often people's identity documents are taken away at the same time that they might be repaying this debt, really giving them not much chance to leave the situation. The last one is an example of the worst forms of child labour, which is part of modern slavery under the Australian modern slavery legislation that Alex will talk to you about. This involves really any situation where a child under 18, even if they're of legal age to work, but if they are doing work that is hazardous to their mental or physical health, amongst other factors, then that is one of the types of the worst forms of child labour. So here the example could be a child working in an overseas brick factory who is exposed to very dangerous conditions, even if they are, let's say, between the ages of 15 and 18, that is still one of the worst forms of child labour. Just on to the next slide, thanks. So why is it important to make sure that you are managing your modern slavery risks and actually understanding and knowing and showing that you are managing those risks? The reality is that apart from this just being the right thing to do, and I'm sure many of us not wanting to explain to our families or friends why we work in a company that's associated with modern slavery, but apart from that, there is really some very good business reasons now why companies should be managing their modern slavery risks. So first of all, we have legislation, and Alex will talk about the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which requires reporting on modern slavery. But we've also just in the past couple of weeks seen some other legislative developments relating to modern slavery. So we've seen the Australian Senate passing a bill that would require companies to prove that their imports into Australia were not made using forced labour. Very unlikely to pass the Federal House of Representatives, but it's showing you where some of the interest is in this area and where some of the pressure groups are sitting. Similar legislation has been proposed in the European Union. The European Union is also looking at something called mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, which would mean that large companies would have to show how they're actually identifying and assessing and addressing their human rights risks, including freedom from slavery. The investor community is now very evolved and getting more and more sophisticated each month relating to what they're asking about modern slavery and human rights. We have BlackRock, the largest asset management company in the world, saying they will be looking at the human rights impacts of the companies they invest in. And Alex will be talking to you about a report that the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors put together on modern slavery. We see court cases increasing as well. And we see in particular court cases coming in the US. One example is this case against Apple, Google, Microsoft, Dell, relating to basically not doing enough due diligence on their raw materials suppliers relating to alleged child labour in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You can just imagine the questions those customers are now asking their suppliers, given that they are embroiled in litigation suggesting they haven't done enough due diligence. So we might go to the next slide, but we can talk about any of these examples more in question time. So just to show you that modern slavery can be very relevant across the entire infrastructure life cycle. So obviously at the procurement stage, when you're looking at raw materials or other materials that you might be purchasing, where they might be coming from. At the construction stage itself, not just construction workers, but also some of the other services that you might be using, particularly cleaning or security staff, which have been identified as sectors that might have modern slavery there. The operation as well. So if you're operating roads or rail In some cases, unfortunately, those types of infrastructure can be used by people who are embroiled in modern slavery, potentially to move people across locations. And some companies are doing some really excellent work to really check and track who is using their infrastructure, and then end of life in terms of decommissioning and recycling as well of components. Just onto the next slide, thank you. And this is just again to show that really when you're looking at the modern slavery risks that might be most relevant to you, to think about geography, where things are coming from, where you're operating, sector, what are you buying, what types of goods and services are you procuring or using or selling to that might be relevant here. And we've just popped a couple of the key risks up here: supply chain, PPE, construction, transport, IT, and also some issues around operations as well, with cleaning, catering security, the use of infrastructure, as I mentioned before, and then also some of the downstream value chain risks, which we spoke about, including the recycling of scrap metals. Just onto the next slide, thank you. So we have had a little bit of a look at bitumen and PPE as part of the Modern Slavery Coalition for the IS Council, and looked at some of the risks that are coming from those sectors, just because they are sectors that the infrastructure sector tends to interconnect with. What we've found is that both of those sectors, because they are coming from the Asia Pacific region, which has a high prevalence of modern slavery, because of their importance to the sector, because of the potential leverage, are two sectors where there are risks, and there are places where people might be expecting the infrastructure sector to really be understanding their risks in that space and taking action about them. Just on to the next one, please. Thank you. So what are you expected to do about all of this? And in a moment, I'll ask you in another poll whether you feel you have actually ever seen any instances of modern slavery in your work. But what are you expected to do? And this is where the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights come in. This is not a treaty or international instrument. This is a set of international guiding principles that has been endorsed by the United Nations and is now really the key standard. Even though it's not a law, it's become the key standard that businesses are using around the world, and governments to look at how businesses can address any adverse human rights impacts that they might be involved in. And it's actually the foundation of the Modern Slavery Act that Alex will be talking to you about soon. The very baseline expectation here is that businesses will try to do no harm relating to human rights, including freedom from modern slavery. And if they do harm, to have processes there to enable remediation, and to use a process of human rights due diligence to do that, which is a fancy term for saying that you need to be able to know and show that you are respecting human rights, and in this case, to be managing your modern slavery risks. And one of the most important factors of this is to make sure that you're not looking at modern slavery risks just from the point of view of risks to your company, even though there are all those consequences I spoke about before, but that you're focusing on risks to people as well, risks to the human beings that you might be impacting, which can be a very difficult conversation to have internally, obviously, when you're also needing to look at business risks. Just on to the next slide, please. So this is just a very quick snapshot at what that phrase due diligence might mean in terms of your own work, and how you might be asked to show that in your modern slavery statements and in your general engagement with external stakeholders. So human rights due diligence involves basically identifying your adverse human rights impacts you might be involved in, making sure that you're integrating the findings from those assessments that you might be doing across your business, tracking how you're doing, and communicating externally as well. So if you think about some of the self-assessment questionnaires you might send out to new and existing suppliers, that's a way of trying to identify what impacts you could be involved in. Integrating the findings could be making sure that based on what you found, you do further capacity building activities with your suppliers. It also relates to the internal training you might do. Tracking, there might be an example there of doing an internal audit of your supplier screening to make sure that you're actually tracking and how your performance is going in terms of modern slavery risk management. And communicating would include a modern slavery statement. Just on to the next slide, thank you. So just to finish up on before we go to the last poll and I hand over to Alex, it's really important to understand how you could actually be involved in an adverse human rights impact, including a modern slavery incident, because what is expected of you is different depending on your level of involvement under those UN guiding principles. And as Alex will talk about, the Australian government has actually asked companies to use this continuum of involvement, as it's called, cause, contribute, directly linked, to explain how you might be involved in modern slavery risks in your modern slavery statements. If you cause something, if you actually as a company have hired migrant laborers and I'm sure this would never happen, but if you're confiscating their passports and we're not paying them, that's an example of your company causing modern slavery, and you'd be expected to stop doing it, obviously, and provide for or cooperate in remediation. If you haven't caused it, but something you have done has been so significant that without it, the abuse really wouldn't have occurred. So let's say that your buying practices really are quite irresponsible and you're setting prices and delivery timeframes that mean something really can't be done unless people would be exploited. It's almost as if you've caused it. You're still expected to stop that contribution, to use your leverage to try and improve the practices of the other party that might be causing it, and to provide for or cooperate in remediation. If you are just directly linked, you haven't caused it, you haven't contributed to it, but you're linked to it, directly linked through your product, services, or operations, perhaps through something you're procuring, then you're not expected to provide for or cooperate in remediation, though you may do so, but you are expected to keep showing mitigation efforts, which is really important as you're thinking about your risk management. So that was a lightning fast introduction to some of the key risks, and Alex will go through in more detail in a moment some of the key trends we're seeing. But I just want to pop up that second poll, if that's okay, so we can see if people think they have, now having heard our explanation, if you think you have ever seen an instance of modern slavery in your work. Okay, so this is really interesting to see. And this is all anonymous, by the way, and we will not call on anybody. If in question time you would like to share anything, you're very welcome to, but it's interesting. We are seeing, it was starting off as 100% no, and we're starting to see a bit of a shift there that some people actually think they have seen something. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to pass over to Alex now to talk to you about some of the key Modern Slavery Act trends. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Vanessa, and good afternoon, everyone. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So over this component of the presentation, we'll share our views and perspective on key reporting trends and areas for improvement in reporting under Australia's Modern Slavery Act. And of course, the Modern Slavery Act is legislation that many of you may have engaged in your day-to-day roles, and it entered into force at the start of 2019. And in sum, the aim of the legislation is to drive business action to combat modern slavery in global operations and supply chains by increasing transparency. The Act applies to large businesses and to other organisations in the Australian market that have an annual consolidated revenue of over 100 million Australian dollars. And under the Act, these entities must prepare annual modern slavery statements that explain their actions to assess and to address modern slavery risks in their global operations and in their supply chains. And these statements, as you can see on the screen, need to address a series of mandatory criteria for content. And in effect, these criteria require statements to explain what the business does, its structure, its operations, and its supply chains, where it considers that there may be potential areas of modern slavery risk, what it's doing to identify and manage those risks, how it assesses the effectiveness of the actions that it's taking, and then, of course, to ensure that statements, if they're given by companies, are approved by the board and signed by a director. And in line with the transparency requirements of the legislation, statements need to be submitted to the Australian government, where they're made publicly available on a searchable central website. And to date, we've seen over 2,300 statements published by the Australian government from entities headquartered in over 40 countries. 291 of these statements have been from entities in the construction and the infrastructure sector, and of those 266 are from Australian headquartered entities. And before we explain some of the key reporting trends from these statements, we'd like to ask what you think about the statements that you've seen and their quality. And so if we could run poll number 3, please. We'd like to ask you about the statements you've seen, whether they're better than you expected, in line with what you expected, or poorer in quality than what you expected. And we're thinking particularly here about companies in the infrastructure sector. And as results are coming in, we're seeing a fairly even split between poorer quality and in line with what was expected. Very few saying better than expected. And it looks like we'll finish at around 63% saying that statements were in line with expectations, and the other 40% or so heading for the poorer quality. So thank you, we can take that poll down. And we'll move to the next slide as well, thanks. So the reflections and insights that we'll share with you today are based on a report that we prepared for the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, which evaluated Modern Slavery Act reporting across the ASX 200. And to inform the public report, we looked at 151 of the ASX 200 modern slavery statements, which was the number of statements available as at 1 June. And of course, a number of these statements were from entities in the infrastructure and the construction sector. We looked at these statements across 6 assessment areas, which align to those mandatory criteria for content under the legislation. And across those 6 assessment areas, we had 41 quality indicators to evaluate the quality of disclosures made. And those were rated on a 3-part scale and used to evaluate the overall quality of a statement out of a score of 41. And if we can go to the next slide, please, this is what we found. So you can see the average score for statements across the ASX 200 was 15.4 out of 41, which accords with the poll result that we just saw that said perhaps most statements were perhaps as expected and not necessarily pushing those boundaries of good practice and better practice. And this indicates that all companies have room for improvement, and indeed continuous improvement is an essential component of the legislation. And it also suggests that in the first year of reporting, that many companies perhaps adopted a safe approach to disclosures, which is why that we've seen the majority of companies landing in that bracket between 10 and 20 points, as you can see on the screen. In terms of entities in the infrastructure sector, entities involved in construction who identified as part of that sector when they submitted their statements to government, they scored slightly higher than the 15.4 average at 17.2 out of 41. And while the length of statements, of course, doesn't equate to quality, the average length of construction sector statements was 4,800 words, which was slightly longer than the overall average of 4,400. And in comparison, the 10 highest scoring statements across the ASX 200 averaged a little over 9,000 words. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Now, while we look primarily at the quality of disclosures and the quality of the information that was provided in statements, we also considered at a general level areas where entities might be non-compliant with the obligations under the legislation. And you can see from the screen that there's a number of key areas of non-compliance. And in some, we think that of the ASX 200 statements that we looked at, there's 151, that it may be up to 33% who are potentially non-compliant with one or more elements of the legislation. Of interest to construction and infrastructure companies particularly, we saw the highest area of non-compliance at 21%, being for consultation with owned and controlled entities. And of course, that's especially important for many of our larger construction and infrastructure companies, which may have quite complex corporate structures and can also engage in a range of joint venture activity. We'll go to the next slide, please. And over the next few slides, we'll dive into 4 key areas of reporting, the first of which is describing risks. And what we saw is that most statements from all sectors, including the construction and infrastructure sector, described risks in a very limited, quite abstract, high-level way. And so, for example, hypothetically, that might look like a company in the infrastructure sector acknowledging that there might be risks associated with certain categories of procurement, such as raw materials used in construction, or perhaps that there might be risks with some of the services that it engages, like cleaners. But in general, we didn't see statements explicitly explaining how modern slavery could actually be present in practice in the operations or the supply chains of a particular company. Contrary to the recommendations and the expectations in the Australian government's guidance, we saw very few statements, less than 5%, drawing on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that Vanessa spoke about, and their cause contribute directly linked continuum to help explain the ways that these companies might be involved in modern slavery. And this continuum is especially helpful in the context of modern slavery risks because it provides a framework to differentiate between the different ways that modern slavery might be present in your operations or in your supply chains. And of course, a situation where modern slavery is present deep in your supply chain in a directly linked situation is perhaps very different to the way that it might be present if you're looking through the lens of cause or contribution. And so being able to articulate your risks using that framework or similar language can be a helpful way to demonstrate that you have a thorough understanding of the way that modern slavery may be present. Of interest too, we also saw that roughly 60% of statements didn't cover risks in their operations, and companies didn't often explain why they were focusing on their supply chains. And again, that's especially important in the context of the construction and infrastructure sector, where we know that in the operations space, there are a wide range of risks, particularly relating to subcontracted workers. And so it's important going forward that statements across the board think more clearly and more clearly articulate the ways that modern slavery risks may be there in their operations and in their supply chains. And if we go quickly to the next slide, this is an example from a company in the property sector where you can see they have drawn on this UN Guiding Principles language to talk about direct linkage, contribution, and cause. And they've identified a range of potential risk areas ranging from lifts and escalators to road workers and fencing contractors. And of course, some of these may be risks that are relevant to you and your companies. And we'll go to the next slide, thanks. The second area that we looked at is taking action. And this covers the ways that companies are actively managing their modern slavery risks. And that, of course, includes a range of steps, such as using contract clauses, different forms of supplier engagement, providing training, updating, and ensuring that policies are relevant to modern slavery. And what we found in the first reporting period is that most statements focused on what we've called paper over practice. And by that, what we mean is statements have told us where action has been taken, but they haven't really explained how that action was taken in practice. And policies are a great example of this. So we've seen most statements indicate that a company has some or more policies that are relevant to modern slavery, and that may be a supplier code of conduct or an employment policy for staff. But very few statements, less than half of statements that explained that there were relevant policies, were able to indicate how those policies are communicated and enforced. And of course, that's the difference between having policies that may be sitting on a shelf in head office and having policies that are meaningfully implemented across a various businesses' operations. One of our other key findings was that in most cases, businesses, when they're undertaking their risk assessment processes, are not engaging with potentially affected stakeholders, whether that be workers in immediate supply chains, workers in their own operations, or their representatives, civil society organizations with expertise in a particular area, or other stakeholders. And that engagement is particularly important in these early years of the Modern Slavery Act, when we're building our understanding of what risks look like across the construction and the infrastructure sector, and where we know that there are still real knowledge gaps in certain areas, particularly as we look beyond tier 1 of supply chains. And so our recommended actions here are focusing in statements on how key actions are implemented in practice, but also considering how to engage stakeholders, both in the context of risk assessments, but also other actions that you might be taking. And training, for an example, is one of those. And you can see on the right of the screen an example from the Transurban statement where they've articulated some of the topics that their training covered. And that level of detail, going back to our paper over practice point, is helpful because it provides stakeholders that are looking at a statement a sense of how the training was relevant to the particular modern slavery risks of the company. And next slide, thanks. The third area that we looked at is remediating incidents, which is, again, particularly important and really core to the Modern Slavery Act, which aims to encourage companies to look for and to uncover potential modern slavery incidences, and then to respond to those appropriately through remediation in line with the expectations under the UN Guiding Principles. What we've seen is that most companies have grievance mechanisms such as hotlines that are in place and that in theory are open and accessible to workers who may have modern slavery complaints, whether those are workers in operations or in supply chains. But we've seen little evidence that those processes are necessarily trusted and accessible to vulnerable workers. And so that's a real area of improvement as we think about second and third modern slavery statements. And so to give you a sense of the content of statements, we saw that across the ASX, 83% of statements were able to indicate that a grievance mechanism was in place, whether that was for a company's operations or 65% for supply chains. But we didn't see a lot of information about how those mechanisms work. So only 11% of statements that articulated that a grievance mechanism was in place were able to explain how that mechanism, even generally, might receive a human rights related complaint, how that complaint would be dealt with, how a complaint could be made, the languages that the mechanism is available, or how it's promoted to workers. And indeed, only 17% of statements were able to point to one or more steps that had been taken to ensure that vulnerable people who might be needing to use that grievance mechanism felt that it was trusted and accessible. And particularly there, we're thinking about ways to address potential barriers to access. Recommended actions in this context, therefore focusing around ensuring that those mechanisms are trusted and accessible. And I think there's some really key opportunities for businesses in the infrastructure sector, particularly given levels of subcontracting, to think about how grievance mechanisms that you have in place, whether those be in your operations or in supply chains, are accessible to the different categories of users who may need to engage with them. And again, on the right-hand side of the screen is an example from Lendlease, which provides some information about how the ethics point system it uses works. And we'll go to the next and fourth slide, please. And the final area we looked at, assessing effectiveness, has been, of course, one of the trickier areas for modern slavery statements. And those of you who have written a statement or been involved in one will perhaps have been nodding with me when you saw this come up. Unsurprisingly, given the challenges of measuring the effectiveness of actions in a human rights context, we saw most statements providing quite high level and basic information about this in the first year. And of course, it's really important to stress at this juncture that the legislation itself doesn't require you or another company to state whether or not your actions have been effective, but rather to explain the steps that you're taking to assess the effectiveness of those actions. 32% of statements that we looked at clearly explained a way that the reporting entity assesses effectiveness, including by setting out multiple KPIs. And you can see an example from Ventia that sets out a number of mechanisms that they look to when they consider effectiveness. We also saw only 21% of statements indicating that entities use feedback from external sources to help assess their effectiveness. And again, that's going back to that stakeholder engagement point in relation to taking action. And so as we think about effectiveness in these future reporting periods, it's really important that as businesses, you consider the components of an effective response. What does effectiveness actually look like for you as an entity in the construction or in the broader infrastructure sector? And what kind of indicators can you use to track effectiveness? Are there ways to think about qualitative rather than quantitative indicators? And are there ways that you can think about consideration of external feedback? And we'll go to the next slide, thank you. And so in summary, you can see here on the screen the 6 overarching recommendations, and these are set out in more detail in the public report, but they cover some of the issues that we've spoken about in terms of clearly explaining risks, explaining how actions are implemented, ensuring that grievance mechanisms are trusted and accessible, engaging stakeholders, and ensuring that actions to measure effectiveness start to look at some of these qualitative indicators and think more about outcomes of actions, such as whether people who've been trained have actually had an increase in their awareness of modern slavery, and not just outputs, which may just quantitatively be, for example, the number of people that have been trained. Next slide, thank you. And Laura, we'll pass to you here to speak about the coalition.
Thanks very much, Alex. Thank you so much, Vanessa and Alex, for those really rich and interesting presentations. Just a bit of a shout out after I'm going to spend about 5 minutes just talking a little bit about the Modern Slavery Coalition, but encourage you after this to be popping your questions for Vanessa and Alex into the Q&A box so that we can have a bit of a chat for 15 minutes after I finish this particular item. Lauren, can I pop to the next slide? Thank you. So the Modern Slavery Coalition is a group of Infrastructure Sustainability Council members that came together initially in 2019 in response to the Modern Slavery Act. The membership to date has been focused on the road sector in particular, but certainly as we go along our journey, realising that, and I think equally as the industry starts to absorb a little bit the meaning and the impacts of the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act, we're looking for the opportunity to broaden out beyond the road sector and what that means. From my experience working on the modern slavery, I think there's 3 themes that are really starting to come out in terms of the work and focus of the group. As Alex and Vanessa built on, it's quite clear that this issue is not an issue that is going to be solved by a single person or a single organisation. So the sooner we can build relationships to work collaboratively and in a systemic way to try and address these issues, the quicker we should be able to get a result. I often liken our journey or it reminds me very similarly the modern slavery journey to similar processes, whether it be the safety bell curve or even environmental sustainability, where we're very much starting this journey from a place of compliance and regulation. But certainly, although it's not an issue that's often top of mind or high on the sustainability priority list, it is a really critical and impactful issue. So the sooner we can accelerate our sector, our organisations through that journey to get to a place of shared responsibility and interdependence is going to be really powerful. And again, the more we work together to build capability and knowledge is going to help that. The third focus and theme we really look to is how do we undertake this journey in a really constructive and capability building way. I think we've got a question in the chat box that'll come up, but there's a question where there's a focus, particularly once we start getting into tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 suppliers of goods and services. There is a genuine discussion around capability and capacity even to engage with these sort of levels of governance systems, especially when we start overlaying them with different cultural and governance lenses from across Asia Pacific. It becomes quite a complex discussion about how do we take people on this journey and help not just remove these risks from our supply chains, but actually build the capability within and across these economies to address the issue more holistically. So it's been really exciting to be able to be working with our Modern Slavery Coalition partners and members, and certainly today is brought to you by the commitment and support of Asiona, Downer, Fulton Hogan, McConnell Dowell, John Holland, Transurban and Ventia. They have very much been coming together to shape the work program, the work and support and research from Vanessa and Alex and the team at Pillar 2, and it's a really exciting time as we really start to take a focus on our work plan for the next 6 months and beyond. So with that, I might switch over to the next slide. And I was going to say, Vanessa, well, you're here, I might pop you on. Certainly we've got a period of activity coming up in the next 3 to 6 months that we thought would be worth sharing with you. And before we start to develop a longer term work plan around what the group will look at going forward. But there is a focus to date on piloting the approaches to the PPE and bitumen supply chains and understanding how do we better engage and get information and build capability within those supply chains, and that model and those learnings we can then hopefully extrapolate out to some of our other value chains and supply partners. There are a couple of little tools that we're looking at doing around developing a supplier risk template for use of suppliers, so they've got something in their back pocket they can start to utilise. Equally a template for supplier questionnaires, and coming up in October we're also looking at hosting a supplier forum around how do we better engage and bring those suppliers to the table in a way that helps them feel safe. Because obviously it's a pretty high risk, or at times it can seem a pretty daunting or high risk scenario to come directly to talk to your customers about some risks around these spaces. Vanessa, did you have any other comments or ideas around our work program that's upcoming, as well as more broadly into the future?
Thanks, Laura. Just to really complement what you have said, it's been really 2 years now since the coalition was started, and it's been really exciting to see the development, I think, both within the coalition members themselves, but in what they're seeking to do with their suppliers, and the pilot projects that Laura mentioned around PPE and bitumen were really just to say, as I mentioned before, what are two sectors where we really think the infrastructure sector, and particularly road, because that was what we were first focusing on, but now broadening out, where could there be the greatest impact? So that we're looking at measures and tools that actually are making an impact, and getting at root causes, and also looking at different types of partnerships. So I think, as Laura said, it is an exciting time, particularly as so many of the members have now done at least one modern slavery statement, are looking to progress, and as other members of the infrastructure community also are looking to progress in this area. So thanks, Laura. Thanks for the chance to comment.
We might pull Alex online as well, as we pop into our Q&A component of the session. Please feel free to pop, we've got a couple of questions in there. If you've got anything else you'd like to ask, please feel free to pop in. Just while we're letting people type, Alex and Vanessa, I just wanted to throw an initial question to you. We've got a number of people attending from New Zealand, and I just wanted to see if we've talked a little bit about Australia and obviously the Modern Slavery Act, but wanted to see if you could perhaps talk briefly around, I suppose, particularly the legislative context and trends that might be coming out of New Zealand in this space.
Sure, thanks, Laura. I might say a few words and then pass over to Alex. So we are seeing quite a lot of activity in New Zealand, asking the New Zealand government to basically enact a similar piece of legislation to the Australian Modern Slavery Act. We've seen letters going from, a wide section of industry and also civil society and investors, basically lobbying for that type of legislation to come in. Because what we've chatted about with some of our New Zealand colleagues is that, again, even though it may seem as though modern slavery might be a distant threat in New Zealand, there actually are instances of modern slavery that occur in New Zealand, as well as, of course, some of the supply chain risks. But I think Alex probably has some better updates on where the legislative discussion is at. Go ahead, Alex.
I think it's illustrative of the fact that the global legislative framework around this is changing really quickly and really rapidly, and in an extent and to a speed that I don't think we would have envisaged even 3 or 4 years ago. And so as companies in this sector, particularly those of you operating across jurisdictions, it's really important that you're keeping an eye on these developments and working with groups like the IS Council to understand what they mean for you. And certainly in New Zealand and in Canada as well, there's proposed legislation on the cards. And one of the things to look out for will be whether that legislation will be a Modern Slavery Act reporting requirement like ours, or whether it will be a broader mandatory human rights due diligence piece of legislation.
Thank you. So one of the questions from the audience, which I know is actually a topic of conversation often in the Modern Slavery Coalition team, regarding supply chain risk, most statements I have seen focus on tier 1. At what stage do you expect Border Force, NGOs, universities and other stakeholders to begin to expect organisations to attain and report on deeper tiers? This is hard, but surely it cannot be ignored for too much longer.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for the question. The answer is now. So they are already expecting it. In the Modern Slavery Act, helpfully or unhelpfully, it does not say that you can limit what you're reporting on to your first tier, to your direct suppliers. And building on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that we spoke about and that are outlined in the government's guidance, they also do not stop at the first tier. They're basically setting an expectation that you know who you're buying from across your value chain, as difficult as that is, as the questioner identified, but that you try as much as possible to understand what all of the different layers are and where the risks are within those layers. Now, I think there is, though, an appreciation that you need to prioritise where the risks might be the most significant, and that there are resourcing issues in obviously going many tiers below the first tier. And so I think that NGOs, so non-government organisations as we call them, investors and others have probably been a little bit more tolerant this year, so that if companies have not talked about what they have done beyond their first tier, they have been a bit tolerant. But I think in coming years, and we'll probably see in some of the corporate benchmarking that is being done, that the expectations will start to grow pretty quickly to go beyond the first tier, even if it is simply to say that you've chosen a priority category, a priority sector to look into some of the issues that you might be facing. And of course, with some of the issues that we see with particular categories and countries around the world, there might be a particular focus. Let's say if the media or other stakeholders are focusing in on a certain sector, in particular relating to those types of situations, you might be expected to go beyond. But Alex, do you want to add anything quickly just from the modern slavery statements that you read for the AXI report, whether there's anything you wanted to add there?
Just to say that as the question indicated, most companies have been very focused on tier one. And as Vanessa said, understandable in year one will be more difficult to justify going forward. And of course, for infrastructure companies, there are real risks deeper in supply chains, whether that's PPE, bitumen, or some of the other areas we spoke about in the presentation.
Thank you. This one I might rephrase slightly. I think it's a bit of a two-part question. I might be able to lean in on one part, then throw to both of you. Does the Infrastructure Sustainability Council have any particular views on bringing industry collaboration down from corporate side into operations? And now I think this is another topic of conversation we talk about quite a lot, is how do we, often modern slavery in terms of its responsibility and accountability within an organisation sits at a corporate level, often within procurement or perhaps legal risk, but taking organisations on that journey is a big part of, and the cultural change is a big part of the challenge. I might jump in initially and just and flag that certainly we've got a big lever that we own in terms of the ICE rating scheme, and certainly it's early days, but we're having an ongoing discussion with the ratings team around what does modern slavery look like in that terms of that context, and delivering through assets and ratings in that process. And it's something we'll be working towards. There's certainly some components within version 2.1 in particular that can talk to and refer to it, but we're looking over the next 6 months to be having a little bit more of a focus on that and calling some of those levers out, particularly within that assurance tool. But Alex and Vanessa, did you want to talk at all around the broader cultural and system shifts from corporate functions to the whole organisation and operations?
Sure. And even with the coalition, I think it's been really interesting because the people, the individuals who have come from the various companies into the coalition have actually come from quite a few different corporate functions, as well as some of them actually have had experience on the ground working on particular projects or operations, or some of them now actually have just gone into that role but have remained in the coalition. So that gives us a nice opportunity to see how we could make sure that this doesn't stay up at that kind of higher group-wide level, but comes into something that can be really, really practical. We've also have had some discussions about what tools we can provide to companies to make sure that they can start to have more of that conversation. Certainly, some of the members of the coalition themselves have already done some really innovative things with training within their organisations. And just in terms of other forms of cultural shift, I think that the more that we make this area very practical, the more that we, just as Laura was saying around other issues like safety, we made these things very practical, highlighted to people what red flags they had to look out for, gave people escalation processes. It's the same for modern slavery risk management in terms of what we really need to do there. And I think that we have a great opportunity now to try and make this much more practical. I will say too, there are some examples from other industries. So I worked in the mining industry for a long time, and there are examples of one of the global mining industry bodies basically bringing together operational and projects-based colleagues with corporate level colleagues to have more conversations, and it's something that I think is worth considering. So thanks for the question.
Alex, did you have anything to add to that one? No, wonderful. One last question coming through is, when will the next supplier forum be held? And I can answer that one easily. We've penciled in the 8th of October, which I believe is a Friday, hopefully if I've got my calendars right. But there's a second part to the question that Vanessa and Alex, I think, might be able to lean into is, are there any other tools available that might assist with identifying modern slavery in the international supply chains? Obviously, there's a broader question there where there's a lot of different offerings on the market at the moment, but Mike, you also particularly talked about some of the outputs that are being developed under the banner of the Modern Slavery Coalition and available to those members, and hopefully Infrastructure Sustainability Council members more widely as they're developed.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think I'll come back to the coalition in a moment, but just externally, there are a lot of tools out there now that do help companies to map their global supply chains and to think about what risks they might have there. Some of these are paid services, and some of them are unpaid services, such as being able to use some of the information that comes out of, let's say, the US State Department or the US Department of Labor. The paid services that are out there, I won't talk about any of them specifically, but I think one of the things you need to think about if you're using them, and some of them are very, very good tools, but really to think about, is this going to help you look beyond your first tier? Is it even going to help you look at your first tier properly? So is it a tool that has actually looked at the various sectors that you might be engaging with and have information? To look at what sources these tools are using. Are they really using a very good collection of sources? And are they sometimes also looking beyond modern slavery to other labour exploitation risks that you might be involved in through your supply chains? Because modern slavery doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I'd encourage you to think about that as you're searching for different tools. And one thing we actually did for the coalition was to one day have a bit of it was almost like a speed dating type session where we tried to describe and talk about all of the different tools that were out there and what the pros and cons were of different tools that people could use. In terms of the coalition itself, we are looking, as Laura said, to kind of develop a tool that suppliers can use to be able to identify their risks, because obviously if suppliers can identify their risks, it will help the companies themselves. And then also to do a little bit more work, as we said, on those pilot PPE and bitumen projects, and potentially add some other high risk sectors to that list as well. But Alex, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that the real challenge is supplier engagement, particularly to tie it back to the earlier question around how you look past tier one, and often you really need engagement with the tier one suppliers to understand the tiers below that. And so equipping and building up those suppliers is really important. And again, in the infrastructure sector context, we know that there's a really diverse supplier base, and some of them are reporting themselves under the legislation, some of them much smaller, and so engaging with them meaningfully is really key to progressing.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you very much for your questions. There'll be email popping up, and Lauren, just as I'm chatting, I might get you to pop up the last slide. If you've got any other questions that you think of overnight or offline, please feel free. There's an email address there, policy@iscouncil.org.au, that please feel free to send them through. So just in closing, Alex, Vanessa and I popped our heads together and thought we'd pull together some key takeaways for this session. Running through the list, three sort of immediate actions you can look to do is look to share this, any key learnings from today with a colleague, very much talking to that cultural piece or even awareness piece. There's a lot of stereotypes and preconceptions around what isn't modern slavery, and even if it is present in Australia and in our organisation. So please feel free to be part of the movement and share some of the knowledge that you've learnt from today. Do be open to exploring opportunities to collaborate with your industry peers, and I've got some direct opportunities coming up how to do that through the Modern Slavery Coalition, but even colleagues across supply chains, etc. It was really powerful. Again, not one of us alone can solve this issue. Do look to review your next statement against some of our recommendations for improvement as set out in the public report that Alex went through a little bit more, and I'm sure as part of our wrap-up pack, Alex, we can share a link to that report that's available on your website so that the attendees and their colleagues can have a look at that in a little bit more detail. A really big piece of the puzzle is we would love for you to encourage, and again, as part of the wrap up, we'll share some of the link to our supplier workshop coming up in October. If you can encourage in the most constructive way possible, so some of your suppliers that you're looking at or would like to start to build some capability on, or even get some feedback about what are the best ways to engage with them so they are better able to collaborate with you around addressing modern slavery, that would be fantastic. And then last but certainly not least, we are always open to new passionate members coming on board to our Modern Slavery Coalition. So if you're interested in the work of this group and potentially contributing some of the work you're doing, as well as learning a lot from other industry peers and colleagues, please feel free to reach out to our team using policy@iscouncil.org.au, or get in touch with any of your IS Council project managers or any other contacts you might have. So I think that pretty much wraps us up for the day. I think we've landed bang on time as well. So I do hope you all have a lovely weekend, no matter where you are. Yes, please don't be a stranger and feel free to reach out to us offline if you've got any other questions or queries as part of the follow-up. Thank you very much for coming along today.